Welcome to the CFDA e-commerce and logistics series in collaboration with Getting It Global. I'm Josh Halpern, your host, also known as the VanBassador, and I'm here to share insights from leading experts and brands in the global e-commerce and logistics space. In this series, we'll walk you through some of the key topics and trends that fashion brands should consider as they build their global expansion strategy. Let's check it out. Hey everyone, we're going to check in with Jose Niño, formerly at Periellis, running all things digital and global. He is now at the US Polo Association running all things digital and e-commerce. We're going to check in on all the insights he has for how you get online and go global and the main issues that you're going to face. Let's check it out. Jose Niño, thanks for joining us. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you? Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure and an honor. Mr. Niño, do you ever find that that's a bilingual oxymoron, Mr. and Niño?
Yeah, if it's in a country where they respect the tilde, I love it. But in the US, it's mostly Nino.
Jose, we want to dive right in. I know US Polo Association as an apparel and accessory brand, but you're also branching into other categories. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. We've traditionally been US Polo Assn in primary category of apparel, but we've also branched out to luggage, bags, eyewear, and coming soon of lifestyle and home items as well. So we're definitely branching out and taking advantage of our world-class brand.
Could you talk a little bit about your current global footprint? What are your points of sale online and off, and in which countries?
Sure. So we're a truly global brand. We're nearing about 2 billion in retail revenue globally. We're in nearly about 170 countries and about 1,200 stores, excluding department stores. The vast majority of our revenue is outside of the US. We're truly a global brand. And our larger footprints are Turkey, India, China, LATAM. We're really expanding our footprint.
What are the three things you're talking about that can really unlock cross-border growth for fashion brands and the like?
The three things that we've noticed that vary tremendously. Number one, it's payments and logistics. That's one thing. Another thing is the infrastructure in a particular territory. And lastly, again, combining two is the UX and return on investment in your e-marketing spend.
Great. So let's hit it with payments and logistics.
So payments and logistics, here the US is our most mature e-commerce sites along with Turkey. But as we continue to roll out different sites, we have 40 global regions now that have a website. We see in LATAM, in many other regions, but especially in LATAM, there's just so many payment options at checkout. Here in the US, we're just used to credit cards. But in LATAM, you look at Panama, you look at Guatemala, you look at Brazil, you look at Mexico. You have Clave cards, which are in Panama. You have OXXO, which is a type of a buy online, pay at a convenience store in Mexico. You have COD, you have e-layaway programs. So there are a lot of different payment options that are available in LATAM. And in many territories, they have a pretty equal share of voice as well. Here in the US, if you have Amex, Visa, MasterCard, that's 95% of the transaction. But in LATAM, you really need to have all the payment options available because they all have equal weight. Logistics as well is something that you need to be aware of. Here in the US, it's a very standardized address system, easily interpreted by APIs when you connect to UPS and things like this. But in territories in LATAM, especially Panama, there's no type of 500 Park Avenue, New York, 10001. It's more like, oh, deliver my package behind the tall yellow building next to the soccer stadium. That's where I'll be. So how do you digitize that at checkout? So you need to have options available to capture all that information.
So you do talk about snap-ons and kind of ways to plug in. What would you suggest people do to actually address this? Let's first talk about payments.
Yeah, so we're deploying Shopify for the most part globally. And Shopify, fortunately, has a pretty rich environment where there are payment processing options that you can just snap onto the platform. Some have more payment options than others, but most of the established platforms have already connections with leading payment gateways that take care of all the different payment options at checkout.
Okay, and now that's obviously payments when we're talking about consumers purchasing from you, both on your site and I presume, and marketplaces as well?
Yes, marketplaces is something that we don't necessarily manage the transaction piece of it. That's more Mercado Libre. They figure those items out. Also in Mercado Libre, there's a concept of Mercado Pago. But yes, I'm speaking specifically to our DTC websites.
And that's important for people to understand. D2C is really where Jose is talking about, because that's where you can actually determine the best plugins and fits for you from a payments perspective. But obviously, marketplaces are a great way to get into a new region, especially in Latin America, because they do take care of all of those, let's say, consumer payment scenarios that are localized for you. Accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. And before I spoke about having options for equal distribution of different payment options at checkout, but you also don't want an experience where you have 8 different methods of payment, because then it becomes pretty confusing. And I think of my older mom who will just be very overwhelmed at checkout. What do I pay? What do I use? So try to keep it streamlined, but you need to have the basics covered.
Yeah, obviously that's key too, because you're seeing a huge increase in penetration of previously non-online purchasers now in Latin America going online. So you are seeing an older demographic that does tend to, let's say, be less familiar with a lot of these options.
Yeah, and I mean that coincides with the second point regarding infrastructure. I mean, here in the US, we've been spoiled with high speed for a while now, but now you're just starting to see high speed deployments in rural areas in LATAM. Urban areas, large cities, yes, they've had broadband and 5G for quite some time, but once you really started to exit the city limits, you'd see a dramatic decrease in broadband availability, which is where more of the older population lives. Now that broadband and 5G is really starting to branch out of city centers, you're starting to see an older demographic go online, and this is more so a new environment from them. So you need to make sure that your entire UX, but especially at checkout, is streamlined and they have options that perhaps they may be familiar with.
And I remember when I was living in Mexico, we would have to go buy something, you'd prepay, you'd bring a bono or whatever, you bring it over to the OXXO, and you'd have to then facilitate it. Is that with COVID something that's moving quickly out of the process as well? And are you seeing a difference if for a D2C site, you're not offering that solution? Is that impacting you anymore?
Well, we've seen during COVID, obviously there is much increased use in our e-commerce sites, but these hybrid model payment solutions where people during COVID wouldn't even go to OXXO as much because of the need to quarantine and stay at home, that by default would cut off that payment option. So we did see an increase in truly digital payment types or digital wallets. But now as we start to see consumers go back and branch out to physical retail locations, some of those more traditional checkout payment options are starting to assume their positions.
That's unfortunate, because obviously it was a great movement from a merchant perspective to get rid of those like additional payment solutions where you have to go to OXXO or 7-Eleven. Also the cash on delivery. Are we seeing a rebound of that, or has that also been kind of hopefully advanced / gotten rid of due to COVID?
Yeah, I mean, as far as we've been able to tell, all of the hybrid payment options are starting to get back to where they were. Now, it's still relatively soon post-COVID to really see long-term if those other payment methods will see a clear direction downward in use. But initially, we are starting to see them bounce back to previous levels.
And staying on payments before we move to logistics, from a merchant or let's say a payout perspective to receive the money from the overseas consumer vis-a-vis your D2C site, how does the best way to do that in terms of paying you back into your US bank account?
Well, it reminds me a lot of affiliate networks here domestically. There's a lag time in the time it takes for the payment to actually hit the system, and also a lag time in the time it takes for the payments to hit your bank accounts. If someone purchases something with OXXO, it's not immediate that someone can walk out to the store and make the payment and then collect the item. It actually takes a little bit of time. Not a significant amount of time, but there's always a bit of a lag, which to your point, ideally, we'd love to see these more traditional payment types that do delay the process of payments be eliminated in a post-COVID world, but I really don't see that happening.
But what about repatriation of funds? When you're saying you're getting that money from the consumers, do you use solutions that do this bank localization to reduce FX, reduce decline rates, those types of scenarios?
Well, we always use local payment options, local banks. So although we have a very global footprint, the payment processor is always based in the country. So that also limits some of the fraudulent activity that would otherwise take place if we're accepting payments from other regions. Also, our licensing setup, we have a lot of different licensees that they have rights to very specific territories. It's rare that we have a licensee that has 30, 40, 50 countries that they can, accept transactions from. So that inconvenience kind of makes it convenient enforcing the licensee to really use in-country payment solutions instead of trying to cover all bases.
So I want to just dive in for people who are listening who have different scenarios. So obviously in the US Polo Association scenario, you have licensees. So essentially they are in country. They're already set up with their own bank accounts. If you're selling D2C from the US into other markets, going D2C cross-border, then of course you've got to figure out that localization to get back into your US bank account. And that can be either through direct bank transfer or through solutions that encourage kind of better FX rates and and reducing decline rates, right, through bank localization. We can talk about that on another video, but that's essentially what we're talking about here, right, Jose?
Yes, that's right.
So I wanted to go to the next part B that you snuck in for number one, which is logistics. Could you talk a little about logistics? You mentioned the issues, but how do you actually solve for those?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult because again, here in the US, we're used to a very elegant API with UPS and FedEx and what have you, to the point that it verifies the address to make sure it exists or that it's within the parameters that USPS or UPS accepts. So it's very elegant, but in LATAM overseas, but especially in LATAM, that sort of address verification is not the default. And additionally, what we've seen is if you're shipping something in DF in the main regions, for the most part, the APIs talk very well. But if you're starting to ship items that, again, are in some of the more rural towns, then the APIs don't recognize it by default. So where the concept of last mile delivery is not that significant here in the US, overseas, and especially in LATAM, it is a big deal. Panama is a region where we had a huge learning experience. The concept of picking up an item at the warehouse by a third party, not being UPS, but a man in his scooter, and picking up a box and then driving 6 or 7 blocks and dropping off the box and looking at an address that isn't numerical. Rather, it's, hey, I'm the large, tall building behind the yellow football stadium. And just think of how are you supposed to integrate that into your shopping cart. So there are options. So just make sure if you're looking at a region where standardized addresses aren't a thing, just make sure that there's a solution, a logistics solution available before you decide to go all in a certain territory.
That's very helpful. Obviously, you also set up a site in Guatemala. In my understanding, now I've done work. I used to run a project up in the mountains in Guatemala for scholarship programs, and I didn't see anybody wearing US Polo Association products, by the way, so maybe there's a whole opportunity there. But what else was the opportunity that justified setting up a whole site there?
We're launching the Guatemala site soon. It's under development, but for us, LATAM is a huge opportunity from a competitive perspective. So a lot of people, they're quick to jump on the China bandwagon. Well, guess what? You went to China, you're going to be rubbing elbows with thousands of merchants, most of which have a lot more money than you, most of which that are going to outspend you on Tmall, and it's going to be difficult to be competitive. but LATAM is still relatively new, and I say the same thing about South Africa as well. So we like to focus in territories where the capex is relatively low, and it's not such a huge competitive environment. And again, to the infrastructure, these are regions where 5G and broadband is relatively new. So you really can get on from the ground floor from a competitive point and have that first mover advantage. And that's part of the logic we're doing in Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, Chile, not as much. That's a much more mature market, but Central America is something we're focusing on.
If anyone wants a lesson on how to say these countries, feel free to contact Jose Niño and his private email. The thing that you used to mention, I remember with Periellis, was the outsized ROI on ad spend in these countries because of the reasons you're talking about. Could you just elaborate very briefly on that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was at Perry, I remember that we can get a big ROI in China. And that was like 10 years ago when we were first looking at that territory. Not anymore. So, for example, you search for our brand on Google in the UK, here in the US, other territories, Turkey. It's a very competitive environment. A lot of retailers and department stores are bidding on our term. But if you look at a place like LATAM, there are very few people bidding on our term. Not only short branded terms, but also long tail non-branded terms exist and relatively cheap, and people aren't bidding a lot. So you can't really spend X amount on bidding on a term like shirt because the conversion will be horrible. It's super competitive and you'll never make a buck. But these short-term words, you can really bid on them in these under-penetrated regions and get an ROI that you can't realize elsewhere.
Okay, so going to number 2, we're talking about your infrastructure from a digital perspective.
One of the joys of Shopify, obviously, is that you can scale out and repurpose assets relatively quickly and deploy sites globally. But again, to the point of infrastructure, whereas we're seeing broadband really develop in these previously underdeveloped territories, it's still not to the scale of US or UK or Japan or China. So whereas you can repurpose a lot of assets from your US Shopify site or your UK Shopify site to launch your Guatemala site, you need to keep in mind that the kind of upstream and downstream speeds that we're used to here still don't exist in other countries. It's gotten better, but you can't expect a 1 or 1.5 or 2 megabyte file homepage to load in a couple seconds in Guatemala like it does in the US. So you really need to respect the Google Page Speed Insights report that they offer. It's country sensitive, and it can really give you guidance as far as, hey, we think your mobile site is up to speed for this region, or you need to dial it down a bit. And that's what we've had to do as we're developing the site in Guatemala, as we develop the site in Panama. We're making the home pages a lot lighter. Not only the home pages, but the amount of alternate views on the product page. Here domestically and on the UK site and in the Turkish site, we'll put a dozen alternate views. But in other regions where mobile site speed can be impacted, we maybe load 1 or 2 alternate views, and we don't use such a high resolution file either. So some considerations, some intangibles to keep in mind when you're launching in regions where broadband is on the rise, but it's not to the same point as here in the US.
That's really helpful, especially because, again, we take it for granted, but definitely there are differences still that have a massive impact on that experience from a consumer's perspective.
Yeah, they've come a long way, but you still need to be mindful about it.
So for these fashion brands, number 3 is particularly relevant because we're talking about that user experience and the information you need to do in terms of localizing. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, those that have maybe heard me talk before, I love to use the example of vaqueros, which is the localization challenge in a previous life at another apparel company. But we had these LATAM sites and we had a Spanish site and we had jeans on sale. And in Spain, jeans are vaqueros. But in Mexico, vaqueros are cowboys. So there's a lot of different dialects of Spanish in Latam, and you need to be very mindful not to use one word to cover all territories. So that's a localization challenge that you need to be very mindful of. Additionally, the size charts here in the U.S. for the most part, our product runs bigger because our consumer is a little bigger, especially now post-COVID. But sizing is very different in Mexico and in Panama and in UK, for example. So a medium in Mexico is not a medium that we have here domestically. So just like you can't make a one site fits all from an infrastructure perspective and site speed, you can't use a one size chart fits all globally or in different sub-territories in LATAM, because it'll impact your conversion, and it's all part of the UX experience.
Do you do things like, from a very basic perspective, you can just create a PDF or you can create a text and describe it on a separate page where you link to? And then is that a baby step that's accurate? And then is the next step doing something like a true fit or these types of things, especially in overseas markets where it may not be set up yet?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we do use these fitting technologies in our larger e-commerce territories, but in smaller territories, these AI-driven sizing apps just don't exist, or they don't take the local sizing considerations into play. So for that, yeah, we'll load size charts that are unique to that territory. And again, Shopify has some great apps that will load the size charts in a Lightbox environment or an iframe, or really give it a very specialized spin that it makes it unique to that region.
It's interesting because when you're an early or smaller brand too, and you're looking at what SKUs you want to select to start going into a new market, are you suggesting in some ways that we'd want to reduce the SKUs that have really varied sizing and look at items like, sunglasses and other items as well? Or
Yeah, I mean, regarding the sizing here in the US, my merchandiser may set my wrist, but I believe the buying is a 1-3-5-3-1, or you buy one small, three mediums, five large, three extra large, one extra large here in the US. But in another territory, it would be different, where you want to have more stock of maybe smaller shirts as opposed to shirts here in the US, where we're going to want stock of larger sizes. So you need to take those type of sizing, merchandising concepts into consideration in different regions as well. Yeah.
so the last thing around that is the feedback loop. When you're looking at moving inventory into these regions, you're getting feedback from your licensees on what sizes fit and what you're selling. And then you have to be able to link that up with your inventory management, I presume in the US or wherever, and start to allocate those sizes. Is there a whole system you have in place for that?
Well, the sizing allocation is really run by our licensees, but when we work with our licensees, we have a good idea of what sells best in different territories. We're so global, we have so much presence in the northern and southern hemisphere. We really know what sells at what time in different regions. But at the very end, our core product is the polo shirt. It's our bread and butter. It's an 80-20 rule, and we just make sure that we run deep in our core product, which for the most part, polo shirts is one of our best-selling items.
Can I ask a question around the Polo brand and US Polo Association, because people probably don't understand those differences?
Well, we're unique compared to, there are many different polo type brands around the world. But what makes us unique is that we're the official brand of the United States Polo Association. So whenever someone purchases one of our products, a good amount, a significant amount of that purchase goes back to the association. The association funds a lot of competitions here domestically and abroad. They support a lot of equestrian programs. They support a lot of collegiate programs. So it's a way to give back to the polo community, both professional and amateur, when you buy product from US Polo Assn.
And it's also some cool stuff, right? Like it's stylistically, I don't know what the appropriate size is for a horse. What you've got like a medium size. I've seen the super large ones. Speaking from the horse's mouth, what would you say is a fashionably appropriate size of a horse?
I like this medium one. I don't like the huge brand one because that's like reminds me of you drive an Escalade with a huge Cadillac crest on the grill, you know. And then the ones that are too small, maybe you need to get really close to someone. And we're past code, but I don't like people being on top of me either to see what the brand is. So this medium size one is a good size.
Perfect. Okay. Jose Niño, thanks for breaking down some real good fashion tips as well as some global expansion tips for us here. And we will see you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I hope guys picked up a few hints, a few tips. Thank you.
So that was Jose Niño talking from the U.S. Polo Association, a $2+ billion company selling through licensee agreements all across the globe, really understanding the key passage to global from a cross-border D2C solution. And we will definitely check in more with him along the way. Thanks for watching here with the CFDA, Getting to Global. I'm Josh Halpern, the VanBassador.